Italy around 700 BCE was not a unified country, but a mosaic of peoples, languages, and regional cultures, with Latins in Latium, Etruscans to the north, Greek colonies along the southern coasts, and other Italic-speaking communities spread across the peninsula, all interacting through trade, war, migration, and cultural exchange in a setting that already linked central Italy to the wider Mediterranean world. Rome emerged within that environment on the Tiber River, about 12 miles inland from the sea, at a point where a convenient river crossing and a land route from the Apennines to the coast made the site strategically valuable, and because it stood near the border between Latium and Etruria, it became a meeting place of Latins, Etruscans, and Sabines, rather than an isolated settlement. That geography mattered from the beginning, because it allowed a growing community at Rome to connect inland agricultural zones, overland movement across central Italy, and exchange networks reaching the Tyrrhenian coast. And the city's mixed setting helps explain why Roman society, even in its earliest remembered form, developed in contact with several neighboring peoples rather than along a single cultural line. Modern historians therefore place Rome's origins in a multicultural context, emphasizing that early Roman development was shaped both by local Italic traditions and by the more advanced civilizations around it, especially the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south, whose religious practices, political symbols, and technical knowledge left clear marks on the institutions that Rome later claimed as its own. The traditional Roman date for the founding of the city was 753 BCE, and by the end of the Roman Republic, that date had become widely accepted in Roman historical writing, even though the earliest periods of Roman history remain the most poorly documented, and much of what later authors described was reconstructed long after the events themselves. Roman memory associated the foundation with Romulus, who was presented as the first king and as the organizer of early military, political, and social structures. And some versions of the tradition also gave a role to the Sabine ruler Titus Tatius, suggesting that even in legend the city's earliest political identity was tied to the fusion of neighboring communities. Yet the main written narratives of early Rome were composed centuries later, after Rome had already conquered Italy and become a major Mediterranean power, which means that historians such as Livy worked from sparse records, legal texts, magistrate lists, religious notices, and inherited stories that had already been shaped by patriotic memory, rhetorical invention, and the desire to explain Roman greatness through an orderly origin story. For that reason, early Roman history must always be read with caution. The broad framework of kingship followed by republic is accepted, but the details of individual reigns, speeches, motives, and constitutional episodes often reflect later interpretation as much as recoverable fact, and the rise of Rome cannot be understood simply as legend made literal. According to Roman tradition, the city was ruled first by kings, and later Romans preserved a sequence of 7 kings whose reigns were meant to cover the period from the foundation of the city to the end of monarchy in 509 BCE, with the first rulers remembered as constructive and the last as destructive, a pattern that neatly prepared the way for the republican system that followed. Even if the full traditional sequence cannot be treated as secure political biography, the memory of kingship still reflects a real stage in which Rome was governed by a single ruler, supported by aristocratic elites, military followers, and religious authority. And in that formative setting, the city began to develop the institutions and habits of command that would later be adapted, rather than erased, by the Republic. the Senate may already have existed under the monarchy as an advisory council for the king, which is important because it shows continuity rather than rupture between regal and republican Rome. The Republic did not create political deliberation from nothing, but inherited and reshaped an older structure in which leading men already claimed authority through ancestry, status, and collective prestige. This early balance between royal command and aristocratic council helps explain a recurring feature of Roman political culture, namely that power was rarely imagined as purely personal and was instead mediated through offices, ritual, and elite consultation, even in periods when one figure seemed to dominate the state. By the 6th century BCE, Rome had become one of the more important states in Latium, and its rise in that period was closely connected to Etruscan power, because Rome appears to have been influenced, and in some interpretations effectively dominated, by Etruscan overlords whose political and cultural impact can be traced in Roman religion, public symbolism, and the outward forms of authority. The Romans borrowed and adapted the alphabet from the Etruscans, who had themselves adapted it from Greek models in Italy, and they also drew from Etruscan practice in matters ranging from religious forms to the insignia of office, including the curule chair, the purple-bordered toga, and the bundle of rods known as the fasces, all of which later became familiar emblems of Roman magistracy. Roman public culture also absorbed other customs associated with Etruscan influence, including the military triumph and gladiatorial combats. And this pattern of selective borrowing is significant because it reveals that Rome's later institutional strength did not arise from cultural isolation, but from a repeated ability to adopt, adapt, and standardize useful forms from neighboring societies. Later, Roman writers presented the regal period as the stage in which the city's primary religious, military, and civic structures were first set in place. And although the details remain uncertain, that basic picture fits the larger historical reality that early Rome was moving from a cluster of settlements toward an organized urban community with a recognized center of authority and a widening regional role. Roman tradition also associated the monarchy with a developing social order in which aristocratic families held enduring influence. And although the fully articulated distinction between patricians and plebeians belongs more clearly to the early republic, the roots of elite dominance clearly lay earlier, in a city where leading lineages, priestly knowledge, and access to office were already concentrated in relatively few hands. This concentration of authority did not prevent Rome from incorporating outsiders, however, and one of the striking long-term features of Roman society, already suggested by its frontier position between several peoples, was its openness to absorbing conquered or neighboring groups into its civic structure, a habit that later became one of the foundations of Roman expansion across Italy and beyond. As Rome grew under Etruscan kings, it became, according to later summaries, the largest and richest city on the Italian peninsula of its time, a claim that should be treated with some caution, but still reflects a broader historical truth. By the late regal period, Rome was no longer merely a local village community, but a substantial urban power whose location and institutions gave it unusual regional weight. The end of the monarchy was later told as a moral and political drama centered on Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, remembered as the last king and as a tyrant whose expulsion in 509 BCE marked the decisive rejection of hereditary rule. And this version of events became one of the founding memories of Roman republican identity. Modern interpretation is more cautious, because one influential view holds that the monarchy at Rome may have ended not through a simple domestic revolution, but through military defeat and foreign intervention, with Porsenna, the Etruscan king of Clusium, defeating the Romans and expelling Tarquinius Superbus before withdrawing and leaving Rome without a king. Whether the transition came primarily through uprising, foreign pressure, or some combination of elite maneuver and regional conflict, the key historical point is that Rome ceased to be ruled by kings and replaced monarchy with a new constitutional arrangement that distributed supreme authority among annually elected magistrates instead of allowing it to remain in one permanent office. The republican system that emerged in 509 BCE placed two consuls at the head of the state, and these officials, who effectively replaced the king, were above all military commanders charged with leading Rome's armies in war, which shows that the earliest republic was not designed as a modern civil government, but as a state whose political structure remained closely tied to warfare and collective defense. This arrangement did not abolish the danger of concentrated power altogether, because in moments of severe military emergency, Rome could appoint a dictator in place of the consuls, yet even that extraordinary office was limited in duration to no more than 6 months, an early sign that Roman political practice sought to reconcile strong command with temporary and legally bounded authority. Alongside the consuls, the Senate continued as a central advisory body, offering counsel to magistrates and to the Roman people, and although in theory sovereignty belonged to the people, while the Senate merely advised, in practice the Senate wielded enormous influence because its members collectively embodied experience, status, continuity, and the accumulated prestige of Rome's leading families. The Republic also developed popular assemblies, including the Centuriate Assembly, which was military in character, and elected magistrates who held imperium, and the Tribal Assembly, a civilian body with electoral, legislative, and judicial functions, so that the new constitution spread decision-making across multiple institutions rather than locating it in a single ruler. Even so, the early republic remained socially unequal, because the patricians initially possessed a dominant share of office and influence, while the broader body of citizens, the plebeians, had to fight over generations for legal protections and access to power, making it clear that the fall of monarchy did not create political equality so much as it created a new arena in which elite and popular interests would struggle. One of the most consequential outcomes of that struggle was the eventual publication of Rome's first written law code, the 12 Tables, in 451 BCE, when legal provisions were inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed publicly in the Forum. An act that did not end class conflict, but did reduce the monopoly of legal knowledge and established a durable foundation for later Roman private law. The early republic, therefore, did not represent a clean break with the past, but a reorganization of earlier institutions, symbols, and habits of rule. The Senate survived. Military command remained central. Aristocratic influence endured, and even the language of office continued to draw on older traditions shaped in part by Etruscan models. What changed fundamentally was the principle of legitimacy, because Rome now defined itself not as a kingship, but as a community governed through magistracies, assemblies, and a senate. And that constitutional identity, reinforced by the memory of expelling kings, became one of the central features of Roman political culture for centuries afterward. The consequence for later history was immense, since the institutions created at the birth of the Republic provided a framework flexible enough to organize war, absorb allies, manage internal conflict, and gradually extend Roman power across Italy, meaning that the fall of the monarchy was not merely a domestic political episode, but the first decisive step toward Rome's transformation into a major Mediterranean power. Rome entered the 5th century BCE as a small republic surrounded by rival communities in central Italy, and its survival depended on defending Latium, maintaining alliances, and adapting its political institutions to the demands of almost continuous warfare. The early republic did not begin with undisputed dominance over its neighbours. Rome had to contend with nearby Latin towns, Sabines, Aequi, Volsci, and Etruscans. And in this setting, the Roman state expanded gradually through a combination of military campaigns, strategic settlements, and negotiated alliances, rather than through a single decisive conquest. The geography of central Italy shaped this long contest. Latium consisted of a cluster of independent communities linked by language, religion, and shared customs. Yet these common elements did not prevent rivalry, and Rome's rise required it first to secure a leading position among fellow Latins before it could project power farther across the peninsula. In the first generations after the fall of the monarchy, Roman institutions were still developing. The consuls provided annual military leadership, the Senate offered continuity, an aristocratic direction, and the assemblies gave the citizen body a structured role in elections and legislation. But these institutions were repeatedly tested by the practical demands of war, debt, landholding, and social conflict. The internal struggle, commonly known as the conflict of the orders, became one of the defining features of this period. Later Roman tradition described it as a prolonged contest between patricians, who initially monopolized the highest offices and priesthoods, and plebeians, who sought legal protection and political access. Although modern scholarship treats that account as an oversimplified interpretation of a more complex process of institutional change. Even with those cautions, real tensions clearly existed. Early Roman debt law was harsh. Military service placed heavy burdens on smallholders, and unequal access to authority created recurrent pressure for reform. So the development of the Republic within Italy cannot be separated from the social strains produced by expansion and mobilization. One of the earliest major plebeian gains was the tribunate of the plebs, traditionally dated to 494 BCE. According to the ancient narrative, plebeians withdrew from the city in a secession and forced recognition of their own officials, the tribunes, who were considered sacrosanct and could intervene on behalf of citizens against the actions of magistrates. The tribunate became important because it created a durable institutional channel for plebeian pressure within the state. Tribunes could convene the tribal assembly, propose legislation, and veto the actions of other magistrates, which over time made the office a critical instrument in reshaping the Roman political order. Another major step came with the Law of the 12 Tables in the mid-5th century BCE. The code, inscribed publicly and displayed in the Forum, set out provisions on legal procedure, debt, family authority, property, inheritance, and penalties. And although it did not abolish social conflict, it reduced the exclusive control of legal knowledge by elites and established the basis of later Roman private law. These constitutional changes unfolded alongside Rome's military consolidation in Latium. The Latin communities had long cooperated in religion, law, and warfare, but they remained politically independent, and Rome's position among them strengthened only gradually through conflict and diplomacy, rather than automatic leadership. Roman territory and administrative needs also increased in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. New offices such as quaestors and censors appeared, and the state experimented with military tribunes with consular power, changes that likely reflected expanding military obligations and the management of a larger citizen body, rather than simply a straightforward concession in class conflict. A decisive stage in Rome's rise came through its prolonged struggle with Veii, one of the most important Etruscan cities near Rome. The contest with Veii, remembered as Rome's first major war against a comparable rival, ended in Roman victory and greatly expanded Roman territory, demonstrating that the Republic could defeat a major neighboring power and incorporate the gains into its own political and military system. The enlarged Roman domain had direct internal consequences. Greater territory increased access to public land, intensified disputes over debt and land distribution, and made legal and administrative reform more urgent. So external expansion and domestic political development reinforced each other at every stage of the early Republic. Rome also endured severe setbacks. One of the most traumatic was the Gallic sack of the city, traditionally placed around 390 BCE, which exposed military weaknesses and remained deeply embedded in Roman memory as evidence that survival could never be taken for granted. The aftermath of that disaster did not end Roman expansion. Instead, the Republic recovered and resumed its campaigns, and the pattern that became increasingly visible was Rome's ability to absorb heavy losses, rebuild manpower, and return to war with a larger strategic purpose than many of its opponents could sustain. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Rome had become the leading power in Latium, but that dominance still had to be formalized. The critical moment came in the Latin War of 340 to 338 BCE, when Rome defeated the Latin League and dismantled the older framework of cooperation among the Latin states. The outcome of the Latin War was politically significant because Rome did not simply annex every defeated community in the same manner. Virtually all of Latium was brought into the Roman system, but local governments were often retained. Some communities received Roman citizenship, and larger states such as Praeneste and Tiber became military allies while keeping nominal independence. This flexible settlement became one of the foundations of Roman power in Italy. Rather than imposing a single uniform status, Rome assigned different legal relationships to different communities, creating a hierarchy of citizenship, allied obligations, and local autonomy that allowed it to secure loyalty, collect military support, and reduce the likelihood of a single unified resistance. At the same time, the political balance inside Rome continued to evolve. The law of 367 BCE, commonly associated with the Licinio-Sextian reforms, restored the regular consulship and specified that one of the consuls was to be plebeian, which gave legal expression to the participation of plebeian elites in the highest magistracy and helped stabilize competition within the nobility. Other measures in this period addressed debt and the use of public land, indicating that economic pressure remained acute. Further steps followed in the 4th century, including the extension of public credit and the easing of debt servitude, showing that Rome's internal cohesion still depended on managing the burdens that warfare and social inequality imposed upon its citizens. Rome's next and most consequential challenge came from the Samnites, a group of tribes from the mountainous central Apennines, whose power structure and terrain made them formidable opponents. The Samnite Wars, fought in 3 major phases between 343 and 290 BCE, tested Rome's military resilience more severely than any conflict since the foundation of the Republic. The First Samnite War, dated 343 to 341 BCE, was followed quickly by the Latin War, and together these conflicts demonstrated that control of Campania and central Italy would determine the future balance of power on the peninsula. Rome's involvement in Campania linked it to richer lowland regions beyond Latium and pushed it into direct competition with upland peoples whose interests clashed with Roman expansion. The Second Samnite War, from 327 to 304 BCE, was longer and more dangerous. During this conflict, Rome suffered one of its most humiliating defeats at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, where a Roman army was trapped by the Samnites under Gavius Pontius and forced to pass under the yoke, a symbolic acknowledgement of defeat that later Roman writers remembered with particular shame. That defeat, however, did not end the war or Roman ambitions. Rome responded by continuing the struggle, founding colonies, strengthening roads and communications, and gradually surrounding Samnite territory with a network of Allied and Roman-controlled positions, turning strategic endurance into a decisive advantage. The Roman method in these wars is historically important. Rome did not rely solely on battlefield victories. It built a wider system of control through colonies, roads, confiscated land, and layered alliances, allowing the Republic to recover from reverses and translate military persistence into permanent geopolitical expansion. The Third Samnite War, from 298 to 290 BCE, widened into a broader coalition conflict in which Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls challenged Roman power. Rome's eventual success in this larger contest confirmed that it had become the strongest military state in central Italy and could defeat coalitions rather than merely isolated enemies. By the end of the Samnite Wars, the political map of Italy had changed decisively. Samnite independence was broken, central Italy was increasingly tied to Rome, and the Republic had shown that it could sustain long wars across diverse terrain while integrating the manpower of allies into its military system. Roman expansion was accompanied by further institutional and social integration at home. The Augulnian Law of 300 BCE ended the patrician monopoly over major priestly colleges by expanding the number of pontiffs and augurs and reserving the new places for plebeians, confirming that plebeian advancement was now reaching even the sacred offices once most tightly guarded by aristocratic exclusivity. Administrative modernization continued as well. Knowledge of the legal calendar, once controlled by priestly elites, was made publicly available in 304 BCE when Gnaeus Flavius displayed it in the Forum, an act that reflected the practical needs of a growing state in which public access to legal procedure had become increasingly necessary. Economic change also revealed Rome's altered position. At some point between the Samnite and Pyrrhic periods, Rome adopted silver coinage modelled on the Greek states of southern Italy, an important sign that the Republic was no longer a merely local power, but a participant in broader Italian and Mediterranean exchange systems. Even after victory over the Samnites, Roman control of Italy was not complete. Unrest in the north and conflicts in the south continued, and the next major challenge came from the Greek cities of southern Italy, above all Tarentum, whose appeal to King Pyrrhus of Epirus brought Rome into confrontation with a Hellenistic monarch. The Pyrrhic War, fought from 280 to 275 BCE, began when disputes in southern Italy drew Rome into conflict with Tarentum, which in turn called for Pyrrhus's assistance. Pyrrhus crossed the Adriatic with a professional army and war elephants, introducing a style of Hellenistic warfare unfamiliar to the Romans. Pyrrhus won battles at Heraclea in 280 BCE and Asculum in 279 BCE, but his victories were costly and strategically inconclusive. The Roman state, drawing on extensive manpower reserves from its allied network across Italy, was able to replace losses and continue the war, while Pyrrhus could not sustain equal attrition at the same scale. This contrast revealed the practical strength of the Roman system that had been built over the preceding centuries. Rome's success no longer depended solely on the resources of the city itself. It rested on a wider confederation of allied communities bound by treaty, obligation, and varying degrees of incorporation, and that system could absorb military shocks better than the armies of even an accomplished Hellenistic commander. After campaigning in Sicily, Pyrrhus returned to Italy and was defeated near Beneventum in 275 BCE. His withdrawal ended the immediate challenge, and the subsequent Roman capture of Tarentum completed the subordination of the most important Greek power in southern Italy. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power on the Italian peninsula. It had defeated Latin rivals, subdued Etruscan and Samnite resistance, overcome the intervention of Pyrrhus, and established a network of citizenship, colonies, and military alliances that gave it unprecedented depth in manpower and strategic reach. The consequences of this expansion were profound. Rome now controlled the political core of Italy, possessed the means to mobilize armies on a scale larger than most regional rivals, and had developed institutions capable of integrating conquest into durable administration, all of which prepared the Republic for the next stage of its history beyond Italy. Just as important, the conquest of Italy transformed the Roman state itself. The old Republic of a central Italian city had become the directing power of a peninsula-wide system, and the constitutional adjustments associated with plebeian advancement, legal codification, administrative innovation, and military command had made that growth possible. The rise of Rome in Italy was therefore not the result of one battle, one reform, or one ruler. It emerged through centuries of conflict, negotiation, adaptation, and institutional development, and by approximately 264 BCE, the Republic stood equipped with the manpower, resources, and strategic position that would soon draw it into the larger struggle for control of the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE as a struggle between Rome and Carthage over influence in Sicily, and it marked the point at which the Roman Republic moved beyond the Italian peninsula into sustained overseas conflict. Control of Sicily mattered because the island sat at the center of Western Mediterranean sea routes, and any power that dominated it could shape commerce, naval movement, and the security of southern Italy. Before this conflict, Rome had completed its conquest of Italy, while Carthage remained the leading maritime power in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage possessed a commercial empire based on North Africa, parts of Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily, and it relied on naval strength, wealth, and mercenary forces in a way fundamentally different from Rome's citizen-based military system. The immediate crisis arose at Messana in northeastern Sicily, where the Mamertines, a group of Campanian mercenaries, appealed first to Carthage and then to Rome for support. Rome's intervention transformed a local dispute into a major interstate war, because both powers understood that the issue was not merely one Sicilian city, but the future balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. At the beginning of the war, Carthage held clear advantages at sea. Rome had developed as a land power in Italy and did not possess a fleet capable of contesting Carthaginian naval superiority on equal terms. The Roman response was therefore one of the most consequential strategic adaptations in its history. The Republic built a navy on a large scale and entered a sphere of warfare in which it had previously lacked experience. Roman innovation played a major role in narrowing the naval gap. Ancient accounts describe the use of the corvus, a boarding device that allowed Roman forces to convert sea battles into close combat situations more favorable to infantry tactics. Whether or not later writers exaggerated its importance, the larger fact remains that Rome adapted quickly and showed an institutional capacity to learn from wartime necessity. The first major Roman naval success came at Mylae in 260 BCE, where the Romans defeated a Carthaginian fleet and demonstrated that Carthaginian mastery of the sea was no longer unchallengeable. This mattered not only tactically but politically, because it signaled that Rome could sustain a long maritime war despite beginning from a position of relative weakness. Fighting in the First Punic War was prolonged, costly, and indecisive for many years. Campaigns were fought on land in Sicily, at sea around the island, and eventually in North Africa itself. Rome sought to break Carthaginian power through a combination of sieges, fleet actions, and direct pressure, while Carthage relied on its naval mobility and its ability to reinforce strongholds in Sicily. Roman operations in North Africa briefly suggested the possibility of a decisive breakthrough. Yet those campaigns ultimately failed, and storms destroyed large Roman fleets on more than one occasion, revealing the severe risk of sustained naval warfare for a republic still learning how to operate at sea. The war therefore became a contest not only of tactics, but of endurance, finance, and manpower. The final phase turned in Rome's favor when the Republic once again rebuilt its fleet and won a decisive naval battle off the Aegae Islands in 241 BCE. Carthage, exhausted by the high cost of the conflict and no longer able to sustain its Sicilian position effectively, sought peace. The outcome gave Rome control of Sicily, which became its first province. That development was historically significant because it marked a fundamental change in Roman power. Until then, Rome had been the hegemonic state of Italy. After 241 BCE, it became an imperial power governing territory beyond the peninsula. Provincial administration, overseas taxation, and military obligations abroad became permanent features of Roman public life. The consequences for Carthage were equally important. The peace terms weakened Carthage financially and politically, and Rome soon took further advantage of Carthaginian difficulties by acquiring Sardinia and Corsica. These gains expanded Roman reach in the western Mediterranean and intensified hostility between the two states, making a renewed war highly likely. In the years after the First Punic War, Carthage shifted its main energies toward Iberia. There, Hamilcar Barca and later his successors sought to rebuild Carthaginian strength through territorial expansion, military organization, and access to silver wealth. This Spanish power base became the foundation for Carthage's next challenge to Rome. Hannibal, son of Hamilcar Barca, assumed command in Spain in 221 BCE and rapidly emerged as the central figure in the new conflict. A capable commander and strategist, he expanded Carthaginian authority in Iberia and brought the city of Saguntum into the center of confrontation with Rome. When Saguntum fell after a siege, Rome treated the event as a casus belli, and the Second Punic War began in 218 BCE. The strategic assumptions on both sides differed sharply. Rome expected to project war into Spain and Africa by sea, using its maritime advantages to contain Carthage. Hannibal instead seized the initiative by moving overland from Spain, crossing the Pyrenees, the Rhone, and then the Alps into Italy, with a field army that included cavalry and elephants. This campaign forced Rome to fight on terms it had not chosen. The Alpine crossing remains one of the most remarkable operational movements in ancient military history, not because it was romantic or improbable, but because it altered the strategic geometry of the war. Hannibal entered northern Italy, having accepted severe losses in transit, yet he arrived with a force sufficient to challenge Roman armies directly and to encourage defection among Rome's Italian allies. His initial campaigns in Italy were highly successful. At the Trebia in 218 BCE and Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, Hannibal defeated Roman armies through superior maneuver and tactical exploitation. These victories exposed weaknesses in Roman command decisions and showed that a Carthaginian army operating in Italy could repeatedly defeat consular forces in open battle. The Roman response in 217 BCE was to appoint Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius adopted a strategy of avoidance, refusing large-scale engagement while shadowing Hannibal, limiting his foraging opportunities, and seeking to preserve Roman manpower. This policy was controversial because it appeared passive, but it reflected a realistic understanding that Rome could outlast Hannibal if it denied him a decisive strategic result. That cautious strategy was abandoned in 216 BCE when Rome assembled a massive army and confronted Hannibal at Cannae in southeastern Italy. The result was one of the greatest tactical defeats in Roman history. Hannibal's encirclement destroyed much of the Roman force, and the scale of Roman losses shocked the Republic and encouraged some Italian communities to reconsider their loyalty. Yet, Cannae did not end the war. This is one of the central facts of Rome's rise. Despite a defeat that might have destroyed many ancient states, Rome refused negotiation, raised new armies, and preserved the core of its allied system. Some defections did occur, particularly in the south, but the majority of Rome's Italian confederation remained intact, allowing the Republic to continue the struggle. The war then broadened into several theatres. In Italy, Hannibal remained active for years, but never secured the comprehensive collapse of Roman alliance networks that his strategy required. In Spain, Roman commanders fought to prevent Carthaginian reinforcement and to break the Barcid base of power. In Sicily, shifting loyalties and Roman intervention turned the island once more into a key arena of contest. Roman recovery depended on political endurance, fiscal capacity, and strategic patience. Instead of seeking repeated decisive battles against Hannibal in Italy, the Republic adopted a wider war plan. It aimed to contain Hannibal, wear down his support, sever his connection to Spain, and ultimately strike where Carthage was most vulnerable. A major turning point came in Iberia under Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. After setbacks that included the deaths of earlier Roman commanders, Scipio reorganized Roman efforts in Spain and captured Carthago Nova in 209 BCE. This success disrupted Carthaginian logistics, gained Rome a major base, and demonstrated Scipio's strategic ability. Scipio followed this with further campaigns that steadily reduced Carthaginian power in Iberia. The decisive Roman victory at Ilipa in 206 BCE effectively ended Carthage's control of Spain. This outcome had immense geopolitical significance because Iberia had provided Carthage with manpower, wealth, and a platform for operations against Rome. Once lost, Carthage's capacity to continue the war on equal terms was permanently diminished. Rome then carried the war into North Africa. Scipio's invasion forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy after many years of campaigning there. The final decision came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio, aided by Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, defeated Hannibal. The war ended soon afterward with Roman victory. The peace terms transformed the Western Mediterranean. Carthage surrendered Spain, gave up most of its fleet, paid a large indemnity, and lost the freedom to wage war without Roman permission. Although Carthage remained a city and an economic center, it ceased to be a major independent military rival. Rome, by contrast, emerged as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The implications reached far beyond Carthage. Rome now possessed major territories outside Italy, greater wealth, and a new class of commanders whose prestige depended on overseas campaigns. The Republic also faced the growing administrative burden of governing provinces and managing increasingly complex financial and military commitments across distant regions. At the same time, Rome was becoming more deeply involved in the Greek East. The First Macedonian War had overlapped with the later years of the conflict against Hannibal, because Philip V of Macedon attempted to exploit Roman distraction during the Second Punic War. That earlier contest ended without a decisive restructuring of the Eastern balance, but it initiated Rome's sustained participation in Hellenistic affairs. The decisive Eastern phase began with the Second Macedonian War, fought from 200 to 197 BCE. Philip V had expanded his ambitions in the Aegean and threatened a wider equilibrium that involved Greek states as well as powers such as Pergamum and Rhodes. Rome intervened not as a distant observer, but as a state increasingly prepared to shape the political order of the Eastern Mediterranean. Roman forces under Titus Quintius Flamininus defeated Philip V at Cynocephali in 197 BCE. This battle was important militarily because it demonstrated the flexibility of the Roman legion against the Macedonian phalanx under difficult field conditions. Politically, it curtailed Macedonian power and established Rome as the arbiter of Greek interstate affairs. After the war, Rome proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks, a formula that deserves careful interpretation. It did not mean complete disengagement or permanent Greek autonomy in the modern sense. Rather, it expressed a settlement in which Rome reduced Macedonian dominance, while reserving for itself the authority to intervene whenever the Eastern balance appeared threatened. That threat soon reappeared in the form of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus had restored much of Seleucid power in Asia and moved into parts of the Greek world, bringing him into collision with Rome and its allies. The resulting Roman-Seleucid War expanded Roman involvement from Greece into Asia Minor. Roman victory over Antiochus III, completed by 188 BCE, weakened Seleucid influence west of the Taurus Mountains and confirmed that Rome could defeat not only Western maritime rivals and Macedonian kings, but also one of the great Hellenistic monarchies of Asia. This was a decisive step in the creation of a Mediterranean-wide Roman sphere of power, even where direct annexation did not immediately follow. Macedonia again challenged the Roman order under Perseus, son of Philip V. The Third Macedonian War culminated in the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, where Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeated Perseus and ended the Macedonian monarchy. After this victory, Macedonia was divided into 4 republics under Roman supervision, a settlement designed to prevent the re-emergence of unified royal power. The significance of these eastern victories was cumulative. Rome did not at once annex every conquered region, but each intervention reduced the autonomy of existing powers and increased dependence on Roman decision-making. Greek leagues, kings, and cities could still act, but increasingly within a system whose final authority rested in Rome. This trend reached a new stage in 146 BCE. In the West, The Third Punic War ended with the destruction of Carthage after a long siege, and the former Carthaginian territory became the Roman province of Africa. In the east, Roman war against the Achaean League culminated in the destruction of Corinth, a demonstration that resistance to Roman supremacy in Greece would no longer be tolerated. These twin events were more than military conclusions. They symbolized the shift from Roman hegemony through alliances and selective intervention toward a more openly imperial order. The destruction of Carthage removed the last major Western city that had once rivaled Rome, while the destruction of Corinth announced that the old political independence of the Greek mainland had effectively ended. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power in both the Western and Eastern Mediterranean. Its authority rested on different arrangements in different regions, including provinces, indemnities, alliances, and client relationships, but the overall result was unmistakable. No other state could now match Rome's military reach or geopolitical leverage. The consequences within Roman society were profound. Conquest brought tribute, indemnities, slaves, land, and commercial opportunities on a scale previously unknown. Provincial commands became sources of wealth and influence for magistrates, while military success in distant theatres increased the political standing of ambitious aristocrats. Rome's victories abroad therefore strengthened the Republic, while also beginning to strain its older institutions. The administration of provinces introduced new problems of governance. Governors had broad powers far from Rome. Tax collection became increasingly lucrative and contentious, and the gap widened between the wealth available to successful elites and the economic security of many ordinary citizens in Italy. The expansion that made Rome supreme also intensified inequalities that would later destabilize the Republic. The conquest of the Mediterranean did not occur in a single uninterrupted line, but the broad sequence is clear. Rome first defeated Carthage in the struggle for Sicily, then survived Hannibal's invasion and reduced Carthage to dependency, then intervened decisively in Greece and Asia, and finally destroyed major centers of resistance in both West and East. Over roughly a century, the Republic transformed from an Italian hegemon into the paramount Mediterranean state. This transformation was not merely territorial. It changed the scale, responsibilities, and internal tensions of Roman power. The Republic now commanded fleets, governed overseas provinces, controlled trade routes, directed alliances across multiple regions, and confronted the political consequences of sudden wealth and prolonged imperial warfare. By 133 BCE, Rome had secured supremacy over the Mediterranean world, but that success carried structural costs. Military expansion had enriched leading families, increased the number of slaves, broadened provincial administration, and intensified competition among aristocrats for command and honor. The victories of this period therefore created both the height of Roman external power and the conditions for the internal crises that would define the late Republic. By 133 BCE, the Roman Republic had conquered the Mediterranean world, yet its political institutions were increasingly strained by the consequences of empire. Wealth from conquest flowed disproportionately to the aristocracy. Slave labor expanded large estates, and many small farmers were displaced from the land, weakening the social base that had long supported the citizen army. The concentration of landholding became one of the central domestic problems of the late Republic. Public land had often come under the control of wealthy elites, while dispossessed citizens drifted toward Rome or other towns in search of work. From the state's perspective, the effect was serious because military service had long depended on property qualifications. and a decline in independent smallholders threatened recruitment as well as social stability. The first major reform attempt came from Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs, in 133 BCE. Tiberius proposed an agrarian law that aimed to enforce limits on occupation of public land and redistribute excess holdings to poorer citizens in smaller allotments. The measure was not an attack on private property in general, but an effort to restore a class of citizen farmers and strengthen the Republic's military and civic foundation. Tiberius faced intense resistance from senators and landholders who saw the proposal as a threat to established interests. He responded by taking the issue directly to the popular assembly and by deposing a fellow tribune who vetoed the bill. These actions were constitutionally contentious because they bypassed customary restraints and signaled that political legitimacy was beginning to rest less on consensus among elites and more on direct mobilization of mass support. The agrarian law did pass, and a commission was created to carry out the redistribution. Yet the political conflict around it escalated rapidly. When Tiberius sought re-election to the tribunate, a move widely treated as an attempt to retain extraordinary influence, senatorial opponents accused him of aspiring to tyranny. In the ensuing violence of 133 BCE, Tiberius and many of his supporters were killed. That event marked a turning point. Political disputes in Rome had certainly been fierce before, but the killing of a tribune and his followers by fellow members of the elite established a new precedent for the use of organized violence in domestic politics. The underlying social problems remained unresolved, while the methods used to address them became more confrontational and less restrained by custom. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, revived and broadened the reform movement. As tribune in 123 and 122 BCE, Gaius pursued agrarian measures, but also introduced a wider legislative program that addressed grain supply, colonial settlement, judicial organization, military burdens, and relations with Rome's Italian allies. His agenda was therefore more systematic than that of his brother and reflected a larger attempt to reorganize Roman public life. Gaius strengthened the grain policy of the state by providing wheat to citizens at a regulated price, helping stabilize urban subsistence while also building political support. He proposed colonies to settle citizens on land, including one at the site of Carthage, and he transferred some judicial authority from senators to equestrians, creating a counterweight to senatorial monopoly. In doing so, he widened the political base of reform beyond the urban plebs alone. One of the most consequential and controversial elements of Gaius's program concerned citizenship. Rome's Italian allies had long fought beside Roman armies and supplied critical manpower, yet they remained subordinate in legal status. Efforts to extend broader rights to them provoked hostility among Roman citizens who feared dilution of their own privileges. The issue would return with great force later in the century. Gaius Gracchus also met a violent end. In 121 BCE, after escalating political confrontation, the Senate issued what became known as the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree empowering magistrates to defend the state. Armed conflict followed, and Gaius died in its aftermath along with many supporters. The deaths of both Gracchi brothers demonstrated that structural reform within the republican system had become inseparable from constitutional rupture and political violence. The next phase of crisis centered on military command and personal rivalry. Gaius Marius, a talented general from a municipally based background, rather than the highest aristocracy, rose to prominence in the late 2nd century BCE. He achieved distinction in the Jugothine War in North Africa and later in the defense of Italy against the Cimbri and Teutones, winning exceptional prestige. Marius's career mattered not only because of his victories, but because it altered the political meaning of military success. Roman commanders had always sought glory, yet the scale of his repeated consulships and battlefield reputation elevated him into a figure whose authority was based increasingly on personal command and popular backing. The bond between soldiers and generals began to assume a more direct political importance. Tradition often associates Marius with military reforms that opened service more fully to poorer citizens, although the exact nature and extent of these changes remain debated. What is certain is that the pressures of prolonged war, social inequality, and manpower needs made armies more dependent on men whose economic future was increasingly tied to commanders, land grants, and spoils rather than to stable smallholding at home. This change had profound consequences for Republican politics. Another critical issue emerged in the social war of 90 to 89 BCE. Rome's Italian allies, denied full citizenship despite generations of military service, rebelled after reform efforts failed, and the tribune Marcus Livius Drusus was assassinated. The Italian insurgents organized their own confederacy with institutions modeled on Rome's and fought a serious war across central and southern Italy. Rome ultimately suppressed the revolt militarily, but only by making political concessions. Laws were passed granting citizenship to many Italians, and the result was the political unification of Italy south of the Po River. This was a major historical development. The old alliance system that had built Roman power was transformed into a more integrated civic order. Yet the social war also intensified militarization and left many commanders with experienced armies at a moment of heightened internal instability. The immediate beneficiary of the next major command was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. A patrician by birth but initially of limited means, Sulla had served under Marius and later distinguished himself in war. In 88 BCE, he was elected consul and received command against Mithridates VI of Pontus, whose expansion in Asia Minor challenged Roman interests in the east and threatened a vital sphere of revenue and prestige. The command dispute that followed was decisive. Through political maneuvering associated with Marius and the popular assemblies, Sulla was stripped of the Mithridatic command, and Marius was appointed in his place. Sulla responded by doing something unprecedented. He marched his army on Rome itself. This was a constitutional revolution, in fact, if not yet in formal theory, because a Roman magistrate had used a field army to seize the city and settle a domestic political dispute by force. Marius fled, and Sulla reasserted his command before departing east to fight Mithridates. Yet Rome remained unstable in his absence. Political reversals brought Marius and his supporters back to power, and Marius returned to the city, where violence and proscriptions followed. He soon died, but the conflict between Marian and Sullan factions had become a full civil war in stages. Meanwhile, Sulla campaigned successfully in the east. He forced Mithridates to abandon conquests and make peace, but the settlement abroad did not resolve the crisis at home. Returning to Italy in 83 BCE, Sulla defeated his domestic opponents in a new phase of civil war and entered Rome as victor. He was then appointed dictator, not for a fixed emergency term in the old republican sense, but with sweeping authority to remake the state. Sulla's dictatorship from 82 to 79 BCE combined constitutional restoration with systematic coercion. He strengthened the Senate, expanded the law courts, curtailed the powers of the tribunate, and attempted to reassert aristocratic control over political advancement. At the same time, he used prescriptions to eliminate enemies and enrich supporters. Property confiscations, executions, and settlements for veterans spread fear across Italy and showed that republican legality could now be subordinated to military victory. Although Sulla eventually resigned and died soon afterward, his settlement did not restore stability. Instead, it left a deeply altered political culture. The precedent had been established that armies loyal to commanders could decide domestic power, that constitutional forms could be rewritten by force, and that political violence on a large scale could be justified as a means of saving the Republic. In the decades after Sulla, Roman politics were dominated by ambitious men whose authority derived from military command, wealth, and personal followings. Among them, Pompey and Crassus were especially prominent. Pompey won distinction in campaigns in Africa, Spain, and the East, while Crassus amassed immense wealth and helped suppress the slave revolt led by Spartacus. Their rivalry and cooperation reflected the unstable balance of oligarchic politics after Sulla. The Senate, though still formally central, could no longer easily manage these powerful figures within older norms. Extraordinary commands became more frequent, and the competition for office was increasingly linked to provincial armies and patronage networks. This environment enabled the rise of Julius Caesar, a politician of aristocratic lineage but popular style, who combined debt, charisma, legal skill, and strategic ambition with unusual effectiveness. In 60 BCE, Caesar formed an informal political alliance with Pompey and Crassus, commonly known as the First Triumvirate. It was not a legal office, but an extra-constitutional compact among three leading men who sought to secure one another's interest against senatorial resistance. With their support, Caesar became consul in 59 BCE AGT, and then obtained a long provincial command in Gaul. Caesar's Gallic command transformed his position. Between 58 and 50 BCE, he conquered a vast territory, invaded Britain twice, crossed the Rhine, and gained enormous military prestige, wealth, and a highly loyal army. Success in Gaul made him one of the most powerful men in Roman history, but it also heightened fear among his opponents that he would not return to Rome as an ordinary magistrate subject to prosecution or political marginalization. The alliance that had sustained Caesar eventually fractured. Crassus died in 53 BCE during the Parthian campaign, removing the figure who had balanced Caesar and Pompey. Pompey, increasingly aligned with senatorial conservatives, remained in Italy with command and influence, while Caesar insisted on preserving his imperium until he could stand for office again. The issue became whether he would disband his army before entering political competition. In 49 BCE, after the Senate ordered him to relinquish command, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his troops and entered Italy. This act began a civil war that would end the Republic in everything but name. Pompey and many senators withdrew from Italy, preferring to regroup in the eastern provinces rather than confront Caesar immediately on the peninsula. Caesar advanced rapidly and secured control of Italy, then fought campaigns in Spain, Greece, Egypt, Africa, and finally Spain, again against remaining opponents. The decisive confrontation with Pompey came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar won a major victory. Pompey fled to Egypt and was murdered there, but Caesar's struggle continued against other republican forces for several more years. Caesar's victories made him master of the Roman world. He accumulated offices and honors, became dictator repeatedly, and eventually held the dictatorship for life. He enacted reforms concerning debt, the calendar, provincial administration, colonization, and the composition of the Senate. Many of these measures were practical and administratively useful, yet they did not resolve the central political question of whether Rome could remain a republic, while one man held overriding personal power. For many senators, Caesar's dominance appeared incompatible with republican liberty. In March 44 BCE, a group of conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius assassinated him in the Senate. Their stated aim was to restore the republic, but they had no stable plan for governing afterward. The killing removed Caesar without removing the forces that had made Caesarism possible. The immediate aftermath showed the weakness of the conspirators' position. Mark Antony, Caesar's colleague and senior lieutenant, moved quickly to control events in Rome, while Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, soon entered politics despite his youth. The Republic now faced another struggle among armed leaders, each claiming legitimacy from law, memory, inheritance, or public necessity. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the earlier compact of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this was a formal legal commission with extraordinary powers to organize the state. In practice, it meant dictatorial authority shared among three men. They used prescriptions to eliminate enemies and confiscate property, again demonstrating how normal constitutional safeguards had broken down. The triumvirs defeated the principal republican forces of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE. After that victory, the Roman world was effectively partitioned among them. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, and Lepidus received a lesser position. The Republic survived only as a vocabulary of offices and ceremonies, while real power rested on military command and personal control of provinces. Tensions soon emerged within the triumviral order. Lepidus declined in influence and was eventually marginalized. Antony established himself in the eastern provinces and entered an increasingly consequential alliance with Cleopatra, the seventh of Egypt. Octavian, meanwhile, worked steadily to secure Italy, settle veterans, cultivate support in Rome, and present himself as the defender of Roman interests against disorder and foreign entanglement. The political struggle between Octavian and Antony was not merely personal. It also reflected the geographical division of Roman power and the problem of how a Mediterranean empire could be ruled after the collapse of republican consensus. Antony's reliance on eastern resources and his association with Cleopatra allowed Octavian to portray him as a threat to Roman political tradition, even though both men operated through the same post-republican logic of military monarchy. The final confrontation came in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, fought off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's forces, directed in large part by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra in a decisive naval engagement. Their retreat to Egypt and subsequent suicides in 30 BCE left Octavian as the sole ruler of the Roman world. That outcome ended the cycle of civil wars that had begun with the Gracchi and accelerated through Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. In 27 BCE, Octavian received the name Augustus and established the Principate, a political order that preserved republican offices and language while concentrating ultimate authority in one man. The Roman Republic had not collapsed in a single moment, but the process was complete. Competition among elites, social conflict, imperial wealth, and militarized politics had destroyed the old system and replaced it with monarchy in republican form. Augustus became the sole ruler of the Roman world after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, and in 27 BCE he established the Principate, a political system that preserved republican forms while concentrating effective authority in the hands of one man. The Roman Empire, in the conventional sense, begins with this settlement because Augustus created a durable structure of rule that survived long after his own death. The achievement of Augustus was institutional rather than merely personal. Julius Caesar had shown that republican government could not contain military monarchy, but Augustus understood that direct dictatorship invited resistance. He therefore concealed autocracy within a constitutional facade, presenting himself as princeps, the first citizen, while retaining decisive control over the army, the provinces of greatest strategic importance, and the central mechanisms of government. From 31 to 23 BCE, Augustus ruled through repeated consulships, but in 27 BCE, he staged the formal restoration of the Republic by transferring authority to the Senate and people, only to receive from them powers that effectively confirmed his supremacy. In 23 BCE, he adjusted the constitutional basis of his rule again, securing powers that made his position more stable and less dependent on annual office. This flexibility was essential to the durability of the new order. Augustus also reorganized the military foundation of the state. He reduced the number of legions after the civil wars, established a more regular standing army, settled veterans in colonies, and ensured that the loyalty of the armed forces was directed toward the emperor rather than toward competing republican magistrates. This was one of the central reasons the Principate endured where the late Republic had failed. The empire under Augustus expanded in several directions, though not without limits. Roman authority was consolidated in Spain, the Alpine regions, the Balkans, and parts of the Near East, while Egypt became an imperial possession of extraordinary importance after the defeat of Cleopatra. Egypt provided grain, wealth, and strategic depth, and Augustus treated it as a province under especially close imperial control. At the same time, Augustus improved communications and administration across the empire. Roads, colonies, taxation, provincial supervision, and local municipal structures were strengthened, making it easier for Rome to govern distant territories and move troops, officials, and goods across vast distances. The resulting stability formed the basis of what later generations would call the Pax Romana, the long period of relative internal peace secured by imperial power. The cultural and political center remained Rome, yet the empire was increasingly a network of provinces, cities, and local elites integrated into Roman rule. Augustus encouraged this integration by promoting urbanization, rewarding loyalty, and drawing provincial aristocracies into the imperial system. Roman citizenship did not yet extend universally, but the process by which provincial elites became stakeholders in the empire was already underway. Augustus died in 14 CE, having established succession in practice, if not in constitutional theory. His adopted son Tiberius succeeded him, proving that the Principate could survive the death of its founder. This was a crucial test, because the empire depended not simply on Augustus's talents, but on the viability of the system he created. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed preserved Augustus's framework, while exposing some of its underlying weaknesses. Tiberius maintained administrative continuity and fiscal caution, but his reign also showed how mistrust, treason trials, and the concentration of power at the top could create political tension. Caligula's brief and unstable rule intensified elite anxieties, while the accession of Claudius after Caligula's assassination demonstrated the decisive role of the Praetorian Guard in imperial succession. Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, strengthened imperial administration, and expanded Roman frontiers. His reign is especially important because in 43 CE, he launched the conquest of Britain, making permanent what had once been only a distant theatre, touched briefly by Julius Caesar. Britain extended Rome's reach to the northwest and became a major province despite the continuing military cost of occupation. Claudius also annexed territories in North Africa, Asia Minor, and the Balkans, confirming that imperial growth continued under the early empire. Administrative innovations under his rule increased the emperor's direct control over fiscal and provincial affairs, and he relied heavily on imperial freedmen and bureaucratic structures. These changes reveal an important long-term trend. The Roman state was becoming more centralized and more dependent on the emperor's household and agents. Nero, who succeeded Claudius in 54 CE, ruled during a period that mixed continuity with growing instability. His reign saw the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, revolts in Britain and Judea, and increasing estrangement between emperor and elite. When military and political support collapsed, Nero's death in 68 CE ended the Julio-Claudian line and exposed the unresolved problem of succession within an empire that had no clear constitutional rule for choosing rulers. The resulting crisis, the Year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE, demonstrated that armies in different provinces could make and unmake emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian claimed power in rapid succession, and civil war again revealed that the empire's unity depended on military recognition as much as on senatorial approval or dynastic legitimacy. This was a turning point because it showed that the emperor was now, in practical terms, the man whom the major armies accepted. Vespasian emerged victorious and founded the Flavian dynasty. His reign restored stability after civil war, repaired finances, and reinforced the authority of the central government. The Flavians also invested heavily in public building and frontier management, demonstrating that imperial legitimacy rested not only on victory, but on visible order, prosperity, and administrative competence. Under Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, the empire consolidated after the upheavals of 69 CE. The Flavian period included the suppression of the Jewish revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, events with far-reaching religious and regional significance. Roman rule in the east was thereby reinforced, but it also deepened tensions in Judea that would later erupt again. Domitian's assassination in 96 CE led to the accession of Nerva, whose short reign began the sequence later called the Age of the Five Good Emperors. The importance of this period lies partly in the method of succession. Nerva and his successors relied on adoption rather than straightforward hereditary transmission, selecting heirs from among capable senior figures, and this practice helped produce a century of relatively stable imperial government. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, brought the empire to its greatest territorial extent. A soldier emperor with broad support, he extended Roman power through the conquest of Dacia and campaigns in Arabia and the East. Dacia, roughly corresponding to modern Romania, was especially valuable because of its resources, and its conquest strengthened Roman prestige as well as revenue. Trajan's eastern campaigns pushed Roman power into Armenia and Mesopotamia, and briefly carried imperial arms farther than ever before. Yet these advances also exposed a recurring strategic dilemma. Expansion enhanced glory and sometimes brought wealth, but it also lengthened frontiers, increased logistical burdens, and forced the empire to defend more territory against more distant and resilient enemies. By the time of Trajan's death in 117 CE, it had become clear that indefinite expansion was not always prudent. His successor Hadrian therefore adopted a different approach. Rather than continue aggressive conquest in the east, Hadrian abandoned some of Trajan's gains in Armenia and Mesopotamia and emphasized consolidation, frontier security, and internal coherence. Hadrian's reign from 117 to 138 CE is central to understanding Rome at its height because it illustrates the mature imperial strategy. He traveled widely across the provinces, inspected troops, strengthened administration, and promoted a more clearly bounded conception of empire. Defensive works, such as Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, symbolize this policy of controlled frontiers rather than limitless expansion. The empire under Hadrian remained vast, extending from Britain to the Near East and from the Rhine and Danube to North Africa. Holding such a realm required not only armies, but roads, supply systems, provincial cities, taxation networks, and local elites who had a material interest in Roman order. In this sense, military power and civil administration were inseparable components of imperial stability. Hadrian also embodied the increasingly cosmopolitan character of Roman rule. He favored Greek culture, invested in cities across the empire, and viewed the provinces not as peripheral possessions, but as integral parts of a unified political world. This broader imperial identity helped bind together peoples of different languages and traditions under Roman sovereignty, though tensions never disappeared. Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 CE, inherited this stabilized empire and maintained it with comparatively little turmoil. His reign is often remembered as one of order and continuity rather than major innovation. Yet this apparent calm was itself a political achievement, because it reflected the success of a system in which administration, fiscal management, and provincial cooperation could function without constant crisis. The age of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius later came to be described as the era of the five good emperors. That label simplifies a complex reality, but it captures an important truth. During these reigns, the empire experienced a combination of territorial security, administrative competence, urban development, and relative internal peace unmatched in many other periods of Roman history. This high empire rested on practical foundations. Roads linked military and commercial centers. Sea routes connected grain supplies from Egypt and North Africa to the wider Mediterranean. Imperial law and taxation provided a common framework, and cities functioned as local centers of Roman governance. Provincial elites increasingly shared in imperial prestige, and citizenship gradually widened, integrating local aristocracies into a common political order. The Roman economy of this period was not modern in structure, but it was highly interconnected. Grain, olive oil, wine, metals, ceramics, slaves, and manufactured goods circulated across the empire. Ports, roads, and coinage facilitated exchange, while imperial peace reduced some of the disruptions that had plagued earlier centuries of interstate conflict. Urban life flourished in many regions because Roman order sustained trade and taxation at scale. Yet the empire's strength concealed persistent vulnerabilities. One was succession. Even when emperors ruled effectively, the system still depended heavily on the transfer of supreme power, without a fixed constitutional procedure accepted by all. Adoption had worked well in the 2nd century, but its success depended on circumstances, personalities, and the willingness of armies and elites to accept designated heirs. Another weakness was fiscal. Armies had to be paid, frontiers defended, roads maintained, cities supplied, and public expectations managed. Conquest had once delivered great windfalls, but once expansion slowed, the empire had to sustain itself through taxation and administration rather than fresh plunder. This made economic management more demanding and sharpened the consequences of military emergencies. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 CE, inherited an empire near the height of its coherence, but not beyond the reach of major strain. He began as co-emperor with Lucius Verus, and his reign was quickly tested by war against Parthia in the east. Roman arms eventually prevailed there, but soldiers returning from the campaign helped spread the Antonine Plague across the empire. The Antonine Plague, which spread between 165 and 180 CE, and was likely either smallpox or measles, had serious demographic and military consequences. Population losses reduced available manpower, strained local communities, and complicated state finances. In an empire whose stability depended on reliable taxation and recruitment, such an epidemic exposed how vulnerable even a highly organized state could be to biological shock. At nearly the same time, pressure along the Danubian frontier increased. Germanic groups, including the Marcomanni and Quadi, crossed into imperial territory, and Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign confronting these invasions. The Marcomannic Wars revealed that Rome's northern frontiers, though heavily defended, were not permanently secure and could require prolonged, resource-intensive campaigns. These wars matter because they show the limits of the imperial system at its zenith. Rome remained powerful and usually capable of repelling its enemies, but it no longer operated in an environment where temporary setbacks could be solved by easy expansion or surplus manpower. Frontier defense now demanded sustained strategic attention, and the emperor himself often had to direct operations personally. The internal effects were substantial. War and plague together increased fiscal pressure, disrupted local economies, and reminded the ruling class that imperial peace had always depended on force. The empire's administrative sophistication could mitigate crises, but it could not eliminate the underlying reality that Roman order rested on continuous military readiness over immense distances. Marcus Aurelius has often been remembered as the last ruler of Rome's golden age, and his reign does mark a transition. Under him, the empire was still formidable, wealthy, and administratively capable, yet the conditions of long-term strain were becoming clearer. Military danger, epidemic disease, and the burden of governing an enormous realm all converged in ways that foreshadowed the greater crises of the 3rd century. One succession decision in particular proved consequential. Marcus Aurelius elevated his son Commodus as co-emperor in 177 CE, returning to hereditary succession instead of the adoptive pattern that had served the empire so well in the 2nd century. This did not immediately destroy imperial stability, but it signaled that the political advantages of merit-based succession were fragile and reversible. By 180 CE, when Marcus Aurelius died, the Roman Empire had reached the height of its territorial scale, administrative integration, and geopolitical authority. It extended across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. It commanded the central Mediterranean, and it governed through a sophisticated combination of army, law, provincial administration, and urban cooperation. Yet the same empire that appeared strongest was also increasingly difficult to manage. Succession remained uncertain. Armies were expensive and politically decisive. Frontier warfare was intensifying, epidemics had weakened the population base, and the fiscal demands of maintaining order across so wide a territory were growing heavier. The age of imperial zenith had therefore also created the structural pressures that would dominate the next chapter of Roman history. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire entered a prolonged period of instability marked by repeated foreign invasions, civil wars, rebellions in the provinces, and economic dislocation. And this combination of pressures brought the imperial system close to collapse. What had once been a remarkably stable imperial order in the age of the Antonines now became a political environment in which emperors were made and unmade by armies. Frontiers were threatened in multiple directions, and state authority could no longer be assumed to function evenly across the empire. The crisis was not a single event, but a long sequence of emergencies, and its cumulative effect was to expose structural weaknesses that earlier imperial prosperity had concealed. The empire's difficulties in this period were military, political, and financial at the same time. Repeated struggles for supreme power meant that resources had to be diverted towards civil conflict, even while outside enemies were pressing the frontiers, and economic disruption deepened as instability interfered with taxation, supply, and confidence in the state's capacity to govern. In this setting, Rome's central institutions did not disappear, but they ceased to operate with the calm authority that had characterized the High Empire. What made the crisis especially dangerous was the way different problems reinforced one another. When emperors changed rapidly, armies became more politicized. When armies became more politicized, civil wars multiplied. And when civil wars multiplied, frontiers weakened and finances deteriorated further. The Roman state still possessed formidable administrative traditions and military resources, but by the later 3rd century, it was clear that the old imperial framework would not survive without major reorganization. Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 and sole master of the empire in 285, emerged from this atmosphere of near anarchy as the ruler who most clearly understood the scale of the problem. His significance lies not merely in having won power, but in having recognized that the empire could no longer be governed effectively through the older assumptions of a single princeps presiding over a relatively unified administrative and military structure. He therefore undertook reforms so extensive that historians often regard him as the real founder of the late Roman Empire, rather than simply another emperor in an existing line. The best-known feature of Diocletian's system was the Tetrarchy, formalized in 293, under which power was shared among 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, the Caesars. This arrangement was not designed as abstract constitutional theory, but as a practical response to the empire's strategic realities, because multiple frontiers required multiple centers of command and rapid military decision-making. By associating Maximian, Constantius, and Galerius with himself in a collegiate imperial structure, Diocletian sought to make succession more orderly, reduce the chances of usurpation, and ensure that no major region would be left without an emperor nearby. Diocletian also reorganized provincial and fiscal administration on a large scale. He multiplied the number of provinces, strengthened regional supervision, and reworked taxation in order to improve revenue collection and make the state more capable of supporting the army and bureaucracy required by a more defensive and more centralized empire. Military reforms accompanied these changes, because frontier security and internal order could no longer be entrusted to older patterns that had repeatedly failed during the 3rd century emergency. One of the consequences of Diocletian's reforms was a more openly hierarchical and ceremonial monarchy. Earlier emperors had often preserved some of the language of republican moderation, but Diocletian emphasized imperial majesty more explicitly and associated the emperors with divine sanction, thereby reinforcing obedience to the state in an age when military rebellion had become common. This shift did not end instability permanently, but it signaled that the Roman Empire was evolving into a more overtly autocratic and bureaucratic form of rule. Diocletian's reign also included the last major persecution of Christians, begun in 303 under a series of edicts and continued after his abdication. Churches were destroyed, sacred books were confiscated, and Christians who refused sacrifice could face severe penalties, showing that the empire's political reorganization still rested within a fundamentally traditional Roman religious framework. Yet this persecution, though serious, did not reverse the growth of Christianity, and one of the great transformations of late Roman history would soon come under Diocletian's successor. In 305, Diocletian abdicated, and with that act the tetrarchic system entered its most difficult phase. The principle of shared rule remained, but the hoped-for stability of succession did not last, and new rounds of rivalry and civil war followed. The empire had been administratively strengthened, but it had not been freed from the political reality that armies and commanders still determined supreme power in moments of crisis. Constantine emerged from these conflicts as the decisive ruler of the next generation. Proclaimed by his troops in the west, he defeated rivals in a sequence of civil wars, gained mastery over the western half of the empire in 312, and by 324 had become sole ruler of the entire Roman world. His rise showed both the limits of the tetrarchy and the continuing centrality of military victory in imperial legitimacy. Constantine's reign transformed the empire in two especially important ways. First, he made Christianity a lawful religion through the settlement commonly associated with 313, and throughout his rule, he allowed Christianity to flourish under imperial patronage, initiating the evolution of the Roman state into a Christian empire. Second, he shifted the geopolitical center of gravity eastward by enlarging Byzantium and dedicating it in 330 as Constantinople, also called New Rome, on the Bosporus between Europe and Asia. The foundation of Constantinople was more than a symbolic act. The city occupied an exceptionally strategic position, commanding routes between the Balkans, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean, and it placed the imperial court closer to the wealthier and more defensible eastern provinces that would later outlast the Western Empire by many centuries. From Constantine onward, the political importance of the East became increasingly unmistakable. Even though the empire was still notionally one Roman state, Constantine's broader legacy lay in reunification, centralization, and Christianization. He reunited the empire after the civil wars of the Tetrarchic age, reinforced imperial control from the center, and gave enduring momentum to the idea that the emperor's authority could be allied with the Christian God rather than with the older pagan religious order. The long-term consequences were immense because the Roman Empire, after Constantine, would no longer be merely an empire with Christians in it, but increasingly a Christian empire shaping the institutions of late antiquity and the medieval world. Even so, Constantine did not solve every structural problem. The empire remained vulnerable to succession disputes, and the maintenance of military and fiscal integrity across such a vast territory still required exceptional administrative discipline. The 4th century therefore brought recovery and reorganization, but not the restoration of the old simplicity or balance that had existed under the early Principate. The distinction between Eastern and Western imperial administration also became more pronounced over time. Although there were periods of reunification, the empire increasingly operated through multiple courts and regional centers, reflecting the logistical difficulty of ruling the entire Roman world from a single political focus. This tendency culminated under Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule both East and West as a single sovereign authority. Theodosius became emperor in the East in 379 and later ruled both halves of the empire from 392 until his death in 395. His reign is especially important for two reasons. He strengthened the Christian character of the imperial state by adopting the Nicene Creed as the accepted norm in 380, and he managed the military and political crises of an empire that increasingly depended on negotiated relations with powerful non-Roman groups inside and beyond its frontiers. In 382, he concluded a treaty with the Visigoths, a measure that reflected both Roman flexibility and Roman weakness, because the empire could no longer assume that every major external people would simply be annihilated or fully absorbed by force. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire was divided between Eastern and Western courts, and this division proved lasting in practice even if the Roman state continued to be conceived as a single imperial order in theory. The Eastern Empire was richer and stronger, with more substantial urban life and greater fiscal resilience, while the Western Empire faced heavier military pressures and weaker political cohesion. From this point onward, the histories of East and West remained connected, but they no longer moved along the same trajectory. The Western Empire's difficulty was not that it lacked armies or institutions altogether, but that its financial base and political unity were less secure. Governmental problems, corruption, abuse of power, poorly equipped or undisciplined soldiers, and the alienation of urban elites from public service all contributed to a weakening of Western capacity over time. These internal issues mattered because the Western government faced mounting pressure from mobile military groups often labeled barbarian in Roman sources, and it increasingly had to negotiate, recruit, or resist them with inadequate resources. Among the most important of these groups were the Visigoths. Originally settled in imperial territory in the Balkans, they moved under Alaric through Greece and then repeatedly into Italy, where they sought payment, recognition, and a secure place within the imperial military hierarchy. Their actions demonstrate a central feature of the late empire. Many of Rome's most dangerous enemies were not wholly external invaders in the old sense, but military peoples who had long interacted with the empire and often demanded incorporation on better terms. The crisis reached a symbolic climax in 410, when the Visigoths entered Rome and sacked the city for 3 days. This event occurred after prolonged negotiations had failed, and after Emperor Honorius refused the terms Alaric had sought, even though the Visigothic leader had indicated a willingness to spare the city in exchange for payment and official standing. Rome was no longer the regular administrative capital of the Western Empire, yet its sack was shocking because the city had not been captured by a foreign enemy for nearly 800 years, and the event powerfully suggested that the old prestige of Roman dominion no longer guaranteed security. The sack of 410 was less physically destructive than some later retellings implied, but its symbolic impact was immense. The city that had long stood as the political and cultural center of Roman power could now be entered and plundered by an army that imperial authorities had failed either to defeat or to integrate. This did not mean that the Western Empire fell immediately, but it revealed how far imperial military authority had deteriorated and how fragile the balance between Roman government and Federate forces had become. After Alaric's death in 410, the Visigoths moved on, and in time they established themselves more permanently in the western provinces, especially in Gaul and Spain. Their trajectory illustrates a broader pattern of the 5th century, in which major Germanic peoples did not simply raid Roman land and depart, but created durable successor kingdoms within territories that had once been governed directly from the imperial center. The Western Empire increasingly became a political landscape in which Roman institutions survived, but often alongside or beneath the authority of military rulers, whose power no longer depended on the old imperial chain of command. Another grave blow came from the Vandals. They established a kingdom in North Africa from 429 to 534. And because North Africa had long been one of the empire's most important regions, their success marked a major contraction of Western Roman power. The Vandals later sacked Rome in 455, providing another public demonstration that the Western government could neither secure the old capital nor preserve uncontested control over the Mediterranean routes that had once been Roman almost without challenge. The loss of secure Roman control in the Western Mediterranean had consequences beyond symbolism. The Western state was less able to project power, less able to manage its own military needs, and less able to maintain the confidence of local elites who increasingly had to make practical accommodations with new power holders in their regions. The Western Empire still had emperors, officials, laws, and armies, but these increasingly functioned within a narrowing sphere of effective control. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire survived repeated challenges more successfully. Its wealthier cities, stronger fiscal base, and strategically placed capital at Constantinople gave it advantages that the Western court lacked, and while it faced its own wars and internal tensions, it was able to preserve imperial continuity where the West could not. This divergence is essential to understanding the so-called fall of Rome, because Rome did not vanish everywhere in the 5th century. Rather, Roman imperial rule ended in the West, while continuing in the East. By the later 5th century, Western emperors were often little more than figureheads dominated by military strongmen. The office of emperor survived, but effective authority in Italy frequently depended on generals and kingmakers, rather than on stable dynastic or administrative legitimacy. This final phase of the Western Empire reveals that political forms can endure after the power that once animated them has largely passed elsewhere. Romulus Augustulus, who ruled in 475 and 476, was the last Western emperor in the traditional historical reckoning. He was not a fully independent ruler, but a child elevated by his father Orestes after the Western emperor Julius Nepos had been driven from Italy, and even the Eastern emperor did not recognize him as legitimate. The regime therefore rested on narrow military foundations at exactly the moment when the Western imperial structure had become least capable of supporting such experiments. In 476, Orestes' troops mutinied and found a leader in Odoacer, a German warrior who entered Italy, defeated Orestes, and deposed Romulus Augustulus. Romulus was spared because of his youth, pensioned off, and removed from power, while Odoacer established himself not as a new Roman emperor, but as king of Italy. This choice was politically revealing, because it showed that the Western imperial office had become unnecessary to the actual exercise of power in Italy. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 is conventionally treated as the end of the Western Roman Empire. That date is useful because it marks the disappearance of a Western emperor in Italy. Yet the process it represents had been unfolding for generations through military fragmentation, administrative contraction, foreign settlement, fiscal weakness, and repeated crises of legitimacy. The Western Empire did not collapse in a single catastrophe. It dissolved through a long sequence in which imperial structures became too weak to maintain political and military integrity. Several causes therefore need to be held together. Barbarian invasions and settlements were important, but so were internal corruption, abuse of power, weakening civic commitment among elites, military indiscipline, and the inability of the Western state to preserve fiscal and administrative strength under prolonged pressure. The fall was not simply the triumph of outsiders over a healthy empire, but the failure of a stressed political system to reproduce the capacities that had once made Roman rule effective. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, continued after 476 and is now usually called the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants still regarded themselves as Romans. Centered on Constantinople, it preserved Roman law, imperial administration, and Christian imperial ideology for roughly another 1,000 years, until 1453. In that sense, Rome did not wholly fall in the 5th century. It survived, transformed, in the East, even as its western half fragmented into successor kingdoms. The historical importance of the Western collapse is therefore double. On one level, it marks the end of imperial rule in the Latin West, and the emergence of new post-Roman kingdoms across former Roman provinces. On another, it marks the transition from the ancient Mediterranean world, dominated by one Western imperial court, to the medieval world of divided sovereignties, regional powers, and a surviving Eastern Roman state. The fall of the West was not the end of Roman civilization, but it was the end of the Western imperial system that Augustus had created and that Diocletian and Constantine had tried to preserve in altered form. From the 3rd century crisis to the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the final chapter of Roman history in the West was shaped by repeated attempts at recovery that proved only temporarily successful. Diocletian restored order through reform. Constantine reunited and Christianized the empire. Theodosius maintained imperial authority one last time over East and West together. Yet none of these achievements fully removed the deeper pressures of military competition, fiscal strain, regional imbalance, and political fragmentation. By 476, the Western Empire had ceased to function as an empire, even though Roman institutions, laws, and identities continued to influence the societies that followed it.